This is a lecture entitled Indoctrination, Values and the University. My name is Colin Bird and I'm an Associate Professor of Politics at the University of Virginia. I also direct the UVA PPL program, which is an undergraduate major that caters to students with interests in political philosophy, policy and law. I first gave this lecture on March the 1st here at the university. It was delivered as part of a series that features professors from different departments who come each week to give a one-off lecture on a subject related to their fields of expertise. After I'd given my lecture, several of my students were kind enough to suggest to me that my remarks might be of wider interest, in large part because of their contemporary political relevance. So I've decided to record a modified version of the lecture and to post it to YouTube so that it might become more widely available to anybody who's interested in the general issue. Now, my March 1st lecture was stimulated by a speech that was given by Betsy DeVos, who is the incoming US Secretary of Education, to the conservative CPAC conference this past February. At a certain point in her speech, DeVos turned to the college students in her audience and said the following, and I quote, "The fight against the education establishment extends to you too. The faculty, from adjunct professors to deans, tell you what to do, what to say, and more ominously, what to think. They say that if you voted for Donald Trump, you're a threat to the university community. But the real threat is silencing the First Amendment rights of people with whom you disagree." Now, DeVos's comments fit into a by now rather familiar narrative on the conservative right. According to that narrative, the institutions of higher education in the United States today have become a hotbed of liberal activism. Professors regularly abuse the classroom and the lectern to agitate for controversial ideological and specifically left-leaning positions. There are now, as you may know, several websites at which students are encouraged to report professors whom they believe have engaged in efforts to indoctrinate students in the classroom into liberal and other left-leaning political causes. Now, I think we agree that if this allegation is sound, it's a cause for concern. Universities are different from churches. Universities are different from political parties. Universities are different from partisan media outlets. They're different from interest groups and lobbying groups. We think of the university as dedicated to something like the impartial pursuit of the truth, of understanding, of knowledge, and concomitantly to the exposure of error, misunderstanding, illusion, and bullshit. And I think we understand that this should be done from a standpoint of honest impartiality. And certainly I think I would agree that if it turns out to be correct that the universities are full of professors who are doing something very different, that's a cause for concern. But I don't think that we have a very clear sense of exactly what to make of this charge. And what I want to accomplish in this lecture is to try to clarify how we ought to think about the general issue that DeVos and her friends on the conservative right raise in this regard. Along the way, I'll be challenging various commonly held assumptions that seem to me to lie behind not only DeVos's position, but behind the larger concern on the conservative right about the possibility of liberal indoctrination in the college classroom. Now, before I go any further, I want to make it clear that there are a number of issues that are in this general neighborhood that I'm not going to focus on. First of all, I'm largely going to ignore the empirical question of whether it's in fact true that there is systematic liberal bias in the college classroom today. I think it's very, very difficult to know whether there is or there isn't. And I certainly don't know how one would devise a study that would establish definitively that there are ideological biases of this kind prevalent in the college classroom. It's true that members of the college faculty today in the United States overwhelmingly self-identify as politically liberal in terms of their own personal political leanings. But I don't think that that means that we know that these professors are walking into the classroom and attempting to indoctrinate their students to share their own personal political beliefs. As far as I can tell, most of my colleagues are really quite careful to distinguish their own personal political views from the stance that they adopt in the classroom. To be sure, it's sometimes difficult to avoid uh, letting certain sympathies slip in the classroom. There are unconscious ways in which one can indicate that one has certain sympathies, but even that is quite a long way short of actually actively trying to evangelize for controversial positions in the classroom. So just because a professor self-identifies in a particular political direction, I don't think we know that that professor is any more or less likely to be engaging in problematic indoctrination in the classroom. A further reason why I think it's difficult for us to be sure that there is or isn't systematic political bias in the classroom has to do with the second issue that I'm not going to discuss, which is what exactly we should ideally expect the distribution of political opinion to be among academics who are teaching in institutions of higher learning. I don't think it's obvious what exactly we should ideally expect the distribution of political sympathy to be among faculty members. I certainly don't think it's obvious that it should be 50-50, nor do I think that it's obvious that we should expect the college professoriate to have roughly the same mixture of political opinions as are represented in the general population. And I don't think we have a clear sense of exactly where we stand on this issue, and certainly I'm not going to discuss it. Thirdly, I'm not going to discuss whether it's true that the effect of a college education is to shift students' political leanings in one or other ideological direction, and whether, if so, that's something that we need to be concerned about. Anecdotally, I would simply report that my experience as an educator is that college students leave university with pretty much the same political beliefs as they had coming in, for the most part. Hopefully, they are more sophisticated and well informed and self critical about their own beliefs, but as far as I can tell, most of my students pretty much end up in the same political position when they graduate as they had when they arrived. If there are shifts in students' political leanings over the course of their time in college, my speculation is that this has far less in general to do with anything that professors say in a classroom setting, and far more to do with other life experiences that they have while in college, experiences that are outside the classroom, experiences, for example, working for particular political organizations, working for community organizations, coming under the influence of particular individuals or organizations that change their minds in various kinds of ways. My sense is that that's a far more powerful influence, for the most part, on students' political leanings than anything that I or my colleagues say in the classroom. Fourth, I'm not going to get into the vexed question of whether the ethos of political correctness that has become so controversial on campuses today poses a serious threat to free speech or open political discussion on the campus, or whether it is in various ways discriminatory. I've certainly spoken to many conservative colleagues who complain that they're not treated fairly in the academic hiring process because many academic search committees are prejudiced against academics who have conservative political views. That may be true to some degree, and I think it may also be true to some degree that an atmosphere of political correctness has a chilling effect on political discussion. But I'm not going to get into the question of exactly how much of a problem that is, or where exactly one would draw the line at which one wants to say, look, this is really a serious issue. That's not part of my concern here. Fifth, I'm not going to get into the related question of whether university administrations should formally restrict what students may and may not say on campus, speech codes and other similar policies, nor am I going to get into the technical questions raised by the First Amendment and its usual interpretation in the United States. Finally, I'm not going to get into the question that is at least partly raised by DeVos's speech, which has to do with whether faculty members should criticize students for the way in which they voted. I mean, in general, I think private citizens are perfectly entitled to criticize each other for the votes that they cast in an election, but I think I would be prepared to agree with DeVos that certainly in a public setting, it's inappropriate and unprofessional for professors to make an example of students in the classroom for having voted in a particular way in an election. That doesn't seem to me to be a terribly controversial point, and I'm not going to discuss it here. Instead, my question is this one. What exactly is the responsibility of professors and educators more generally to avoid taking controversial positions in the classroom? I think we all have a sense that there is some line at which appropriate pedagogy flips over into inappropriate propagandization and evangelism. But I don't think we have a clear idea of where that line is, and that's partly what I want to address in my lecture. I think this is an important question for three reasons. First of all, when people like DeVos complain about liberal indoctrination and bias in the college classroom, they assume that we can rely on a clear, shared understanding of what exactly distinguishes indoctrination and bias from a stance of impartiality behind the lectern. And I just don't think that there is any such clear understanding. And I think we could use a good deal of clarification on this point. And I hope that my lecture might contribute a little bit to providing such clarification. My second reason for pursuing this question is a little bit more personal. I'm a political theorist, and so I spend much of my professional life, both in my research and in the classroom, exploring questions of political value. That is, I teach classes that deal with such questions as, what exactly does the ideal of justice demand of our societies? Are welfare states an affront to justice, or are they required by justice? Is private property a liberating institution, or is it, as Marxists have often claimed, an oppressive institution? These are engaged questions that require value judgments about the character and quality of different forms of political and social organization. So I don't have the luxury that is enjoyed by my colleagues in, for example, the natural sciences, of being able to assume that the students I confront in the lecture theatre don't already have certain strong ideological views about the subjects that we're going to discuss. If I'm a physicist who studies elementary particles, I don't usually have to worry that there are some of my students who have very, very strong ideological commitments to particular views about electrons or bosons or quarks. But as a political theorist, I regularly walk into the classroom and get into discussions of political issues that I know are very controversial among the students in the room. Many people are inclined to say that this, in fact, is something that sharply distinguishes the study of subjects like political theory from inquiry in the sciences, because the sciences deal with impartial questions of fact, objective, hard, empirical data, whereas political theory and political philosophy deals with subjective, woolly questions about value, and we can't make serious intellectual progress in this area as we can in the empirical hard sciences. I think that view is confused, and one of the things I want to bring out in this lecture is why it's confused and how it bears on this general allegation made by DeVos that there is problematic bias in the college classroom today. Finally, I think that the confusions that I hope to expose around these issues are bound up in complex ways with our parlous political situation today. Political dialogue and discussion and discourse are in a very bad way. It seems very, very difficult for us to hold intelligent political discussion any longer. And I think that our difficulties in making headway in political deliberation at least partly reflect some of these underlying confusions about indoctrination and political bias that I'm going to talk about in the body of this lecture. The particular claim of DeVos's that I'm going to focus on is the statement that she makes, quote, "The faculty from adjunct professors to deans tell you what to do, what to say, and more ominously, what to think." Now, I think the key part of that phrase is the suggestion that there's something problematic about professors telling students what to think. I think that's the really important claim, because I think telling people what to do or what to say is in large part going to be governed by what they think. And so it's already covered by this general worry about telling students what to think. So I want to raise the question, why exactly might one think that it's problematic or ominous for faculty members to be telling their students what to think in the classroom? And I think the answer to this question depends to a heavy extent on what we mean by the phrase telling students what to think. Surely there are some construals of this phrase that would be entirely innocuous. Surely I think we would all agree that professors should tell their students how and what to think about the correct solution to an equation, even though the correct solution to an equation and the reasons why it's the correct solution can be appreciated only in thought. Equations are not facts. They're things that can only be apprehended in one's mind. But I don't think very many people would think that it's inappropriate for professors to tell students that they've gotten an equation wrong or made an error in the solution that they've offered. Similarly, I think most of us would agree that professors should tell their students to think that the French Revolution started in the 18th century and not in the 17th century. So generally, I think we could agree that professors should tell the truth and tell students to think the truth. That seems reasonably uncontroversial. At the other extreme, I think there are some ways of telling students what to think that are clearly inappropriate. Any attempt to coerce a student into certain beliefs or to manipulate their thoughts in particular kinds of ways, intimidating students to profess certain beliefs, shaming or bullying students in the classroom. These are clearly inappropriate ways to tell students what to think in the classroom. And I don't think this is controversial either. So hopefully we can agree on these extreme cases, but I think all of the important questioning has to do with the intermediate terrain in the middle, where things are a little bit more complicated. And that's what I hope to shed some light on now. Sometimes people here say that all you need to make sense of this is to distinguish between professors telling students how to think and professors telling students what to think. So on this view, here's my number one on the slide. It's okay for professors to tell students how to think and how to judge rationally. That is, how to apply canons of logic, canons of empirical evidence, how to weigh competing theories, how to distinguish cogent from fallacious arguments, how to interpret evidence sensitively rather than crassly, and so on and so forth. So one might think it's okay for professors to tell students how to think in that sense, but then also to say that professors can tell students what to think only when the professors are reporting well-attested facts or empirical claims. They should never be telling students what to think about what values to endorse. Now that sounds plausible enough at first hearing. Unfortunately, I don't think it will do, because those two claims, 1 and 2 on my slide there, they're actually inconsistent with each other, as a little bit of reflection will reveal. The problem is that how to think is not simply a matter of appreciating facts. It's also a matter of embracing certain values, because how to think is a matter of following valid and sound rules and principles of rational inquiry. Those principles and precepts are not themselves facts. They're values, values of rationality. If I point out to a student that they've misinterpreted the evidence and reached an incorrect conclusion, I'm telling the students that their argument is bad. They've given a lousy interpretation of the evidence. If I point out to a student that the argument that they've presented in their paper is fallacious or spurious, I'm telling them that their reasoning is not cogent and therefore poor. These are all value judgments. So if one is true, if it's permissible for faculty members to tell students how to think and judge, then 2 on the slide has to be false. It must be okay in at least some cases for professors to tell their students not only the facts, but also to tell them what standards of rational judgment they should use. So we have to amend this initial proposal as follows. So here's number 3. Professors can tell students what to think by reporting well-attested facts and by identifying the standards and values of rational inquiry and judgment that they should use. So there it is again. And I think, as stated, that sounds reasonable enough. But there are some ambiguities that quickly arise about what exactly it rules in and what exactly it rules out. So here are some fairly obvious ambiguities that we would need to iron out. What about theories? I'm thinking here not of controversial political theories like Marxism or liberalism, the kinds of things that I talk about in my classes, but for now I'm just talking about straightforward scientific theories like Darwin's theory of natural selection or Einstein's general and special theories of relativity. These scientific theories are in themselves neither facts nor are they rules or standards of rational inquiry. Rather, they are interpretations of the evidence and the data that has been reached and validated on the basis of the rules of rational inquiry. Surely we would agree that professors can indeed tell students that they should judge these theories as true, as sound, or as valid as far as we know. When I say that professors can surely permissibly tell their students to think that these theories are, as best we know it, true, true here doesn't mean beyond all possible doubt. Responsible professors, of course, scientists, biologists, physicists are going to acknowledge, look, these theories are good theories because they represent the best, most reliable interpretation of the data we've been able to come up with. But no honest scientist can say that these are theories that are beyond all possible dispute, because one never knows what data is going to come in next week from the Fermi lab, and we're going to have to suddenly revise our theory. The history of modern science is, as everybody knows, a story of conventional wisdom and orthodoxy being overturned in the face of new and unexpected data. Indeed, both Einstein's theory and Darwin's theories fall into precisely that category. So it would seem that we at least also have to say that professors are allowed to tell students to think that certain kinds of theories are true in at least some instances. I think it's also important to see that reporting well-attested facts and identifying the standards and values of rational inquiry, 3A and 3B on the tag at the top there, they have to be interdependent. Well-attested in 3A must mean something like, because it's rational to treat these as facts. So what counts as a fact depends fundamentally on what it is rational to think. So I think we can also add that 3b is really the crucial precept in the formula that is at the top of the slide there. And what that means is that if we agree, 3b, that professors are allowed to tell students what it means to think and judge rationally and reasonably, everything in this discussion ultimately is going to depend on how we construe the notion of rationality or reasonableness, the notion of rational judgment and reasonable inquiry. So a lot rides on how we understand the normative notion of rationality. So far, I hope we've agreed that truth-telling professors can promote standards of rational judgment and inquiry, and secondly, that this can't just be a matter of sticking to the facts and avoiding the expression of opinions or value judgments. Theories like Darwin's theory of natural selection express opinions about, for example, how speciation occurs. The values of rational inquiry are values. Rationality is a value. Should is part of our concept of what it is to be a rational person. What should count as a fact depends on rational judgment. It depends on the reasons we have for adopting or holding certain kinds of beliefs. And reasons are things that are good reasons as opposed to bad reasons. Some have argued that, strictly speaking, there can't be any such thing as a bad reason, because if it's a bad reason, it's no sort of reason. So the only reasons there are good reasons, and that's the point of saying that rationality and reasonableness are values. So we can reformulate the position that I presented at the start of the lecture now in terms of reasonableness and rationality. So we can agree that at one end of the spectrum, it's okay for professors to tell students to think things like those who believe that the earth is flat are being irrational. That seems like a perfectly reasonable way for faculty members to tell their students to think certain kinds of things. Again, at the opposite end of the spectrum, I think we would all agree that it's not okay for professors to tell students no rational person can reject Marxism, no rational person can reject Christianity, no reasonable person can be an atheist or a conservative. I think we would agree that that's beyond the pale. So we need to analyze this in terms of when it is or isn't reasonable for faculty members to tell their students to think these things. Now, at this point, people often suggest that the key term that we need is the notion of controversiality. One might canvass the following controversiality test. Truth-telling professors should never argue for controversial views from the lectern. But I think this too is a hopelessly problematic proposal on rather rapid reflection. First of all, and perhaps most obviously, intellectual progress requires taking and defending controversial positions. Intellectual life would stagnate completely if professors restricted themselves only to repeating the existing accepted consensus. It would be very quickly extremely boring to go to college because people would just be repeating things that are already very well accepted. But of course, intellectual progress requires that somebody put their head above the parapet from time to time and defend an unorthodox position. After all, today's heresy is often tomorrow's orthodoxy. And again, Darwin's theory of evolution and Einstein's reconfiguration of thinking about space and time and gravity, these are both cases in point. So it seems a little strange to say that faculty members shouldn't be taking controversial positions when the whole activity of intellectual inquiry would seem to require that they do just that. Also, we would need, if this proposal is to fly, we would need to reach some agreement on what counts as controversial. And here I think it's very important to notice that what counts as controversial can't just be anything that in fact empirically provokes disagreement. We can't say that something is controversial just because, as a matter of fact, people dispute it or are in disagreement about it, because that would prevent us, at least under the controversiality test on your slide there, that would prevent faculty members from presenting very many theories as valid theories in the classroom. This would go not only for more controversial political theories having to do with justice or the authority of the state, it would also go for various fairly well-established aspects of the natural sciences, such as Darwinism or claims about climate change, or in physics, claims about string theory. These are all scientific theories about which there is, in fact, actual disagreement. There are lots of religious people, for example, who simply will not accept Darwinism. There are some physicists who regard string theory as an invalid theory in science because some of its assumptions are unverifiable, and so it can't count on that view as a genuinely scientific theory. But if we were to infer from the fact that people do in fact disagree about these things, that therefore truth-telling professors can't walk into the classroom and discuss or advocate particular claims about how speciation occurs, or about how string theory might explain this or that feature of particle physics, or why we should believe that climate change is an anthropogenic problem, then again, we would have to purge the classroom from a great deal of what we would take for granted as being part of the remit of professors. So we can't define controversial really simply in terms of what actually empirically provokes disagreement. Controversial has to mean something more like subject to reasonable disagreement. But I think here again we have to notice that what's doing all the work here is some implicit understanding of what it is reasonable to disagree about and what it is unreasonable to disagree about. So once again, we come back to this fundamental value of reasonableness and rationality. So we've chased our question down now to a further formulation. We should perhaps reformulate our question as, well, okay, how should then professors conduct themselves in the classroom under conditions of reasonable disagreement? Now, at this point, some advocate a view that I like to call the supermarket model. And according to the supermarket model, when there's reasonable disagreement, professors should cultivate as far as possible a stance of neutrality. And they can do this by leaving the relevant issues as far as possible open for debate. They should present the arguments for all sides and then let students decide for themselves. And they should generally avoid efforts to persuade students that one or other position that is subject to reasonable dispute in the relevant debates is of greater plausibility than the others. What professors should do, as it were, is present the alternatives and then leave the students to decide for themselves which one of those alternatives they buy or are more inclined to buy. So we use this language of buying the argument or not buying the argument. That's why I refer to this as the supermarket model. Now, I think the supermarket model is in some ways an attractive one, and certainly it's a model that many of my colleagues, I think, follow in the classroom, and I doubt that they're doing anything really radically wrong in so doing. Nonetheless, I think we should reject the supermarket model. I think it's too restrictive, and there are a couple of reasons for this. If a professor honestly believes that some theory or view is superior to the alternatives, why shouldn't he or she explain to the students their reasons for that belief and seek to defend the relevant position in response to students' objections. After all, this is what most professors do in their day-to-day research. They try to identify the better theory. They try to come up with better explanations for the causes of the French Revolution, or how to understand the particle physics or speciation or whatever it might happen to be. Professors spend their professional activity trying to identify the better theories and arguing for those theories. Why, if that's what they do in their books, in their journal articles, why should they suddenly adopt a different posture when they walk into the classroom and address themselves to students? Shouldn't these two activities be essentially continuous and be governed by the same basic logic? I don't see any obvious reason why, for that reason, professors shouldn't be allowed to simply present their arguments in favor of one or another positions that are subject to reasonable disagreement. There's also, I think, a risk of serious distortion that comes with the supermarket model. And the first of these distortions is the danger that it encourages the confused view that when there is reasonable disagreement about something, it follows that the various different positions that are subject to reasonable disagreement enjoy a presumption of equal plausibility or equal validity. And that implication is simply false. It just isn't true that just because there's reasonable disagreement about something, it follows that all of the relevant positions are equally plausible. I think we can check this with regard to our assumptions about, for example, religious beliefs. Religious beliefs are, I think, objects of reasonable disagreement. Some of us are Muslims, some of us are atheists, some of us are Buddhists, some of us are Christians. Presumably, people have reasons for hanging on to their religious propensities and beliefs. I don't think it's plausible to think that people just randomly engage in completely blind acts of faith with regard to their religious propensities. Rather, if you ask them, well, why are you a Christian? They'll actually give you something like an explanation. They'll say, well, I know that there are problems with religious, with biblical interpretation and with Christian doctrine, but I've thought long and hard about the struggles that I face in life and the things that matter, and I found that the paradigm that makes the best sense of how I choose to lead my life is the Christian one. Similarly, atheists are going to say, look, I can't make sense of this particular way of understanding the world and orienting oneself to the cosmos. But this is a reasonable disagreement. This is a disagreement among reasonable beings who interpret related sets of experiences or data in different ways. But that doesn't mean that all religious beliefs are equally plausible. It doesn't mean that atheism is just as plausible as Buddhism, or that Hinduism is just as plausible as Christianity. If it did entail that they're all equally plausible, then people should either just suspend their judgment and say, well, look, I have no stronger reason to be a Christian than an atheist, or they should simply choose their beliefs at random by tossing a coin, and that doesn't seem like an appropriate way to approach the question at all. So I worry that the supermarket model encourages this confusion, that where there's reasonable disagreement, it follows that all the relevant positions are equally plausible, and that's simply not true. And if they're not equally plausible, then why shouldn't a professor, in conditions of reasonable agreement, offer their own good faith arguments in favor of a particular position in the classroom? A second and related distortion, which I think is particularly germane to our current political situation, is that the supermarket model encourages the confusion of objectivity with value neutrality. That is, it encourages students to think, that in order to be objective in the classroom, the professor has to remain neutral on disputed questions, in this case on disputed questions about what it's reasonable to believe. But again, if you agree with me that just because something is the object of reasonable disagreement, it doesn't follow that all of the relevant positions that are subject to that reasonable disagreement are equally plausible, then why shouldn't professors, who are being as objective as one would ever wish to be, step forward and offer their best arguments for why the particular position that they prefer enjoys superiority over others? Again, students don't have to accept the arguments, but there's nothing non-objective or partisan about a professor simply offering their own good faith reasons for a judgment on the merits, even under conditions of reasonable disagreement. And that confusion of objectivity with value neutrality has produced all sorts of baneful distortions in the way we think about politics. It's had the effect, I think, of displacing an ethos of truth-seeking with an ethos of dogmatic self-expression, and a tendency for people to forget that rational judgment is not simply a matter of appreciating facts, but also a matter of making wise and reasonable judgments on the basis of those facts. And that's just to conform to various values of rational judgment. So there's no way to avoid certain kinds of values in this area. So I'm not convinced that the supermarket model is one we should adopt. Instead, I would argue for a slightly different model, which I'm going to call non-dogmatic advocacy. On non-dogmatic advocacy, it's always okay for professors to try to persuade their students of views that are subject to reasonable disagreement, even if students might not find those views congenial, as long as they satisfy the following conditions. First, they appeal only to the force of reasons and arguments in their efforts to convince students. They don't try to manipulate students' views by pushing their buttons or appealing to their emotions. They appeal only to rational methods of persuasion. Secondly, they're prepared to acknowledge the possibility that they might be wrong about the issue, that they're fallible, and that therefore if somebody points out how they've made an error in their thinking, that they should be willing to defer to that correction. Thirdly, that they should always do their best to reconstruct the best possible defenses of alternative views that contradict the particular views that they are arguing for. That's a precept of charity towards one's opposition. Fourthly, they should be sincere. That is, they should defend only those positions that they sincerely themselves believe to be well-grounded and that they sincerely judge to be the best theories given the question that is under consideration. And then finally, there's a condition of non-privilege. That is, apart from any greater expertise or greater knowledge that they have about particular subjects, nothing about their being a professor, nothing about them having a certain professional or institutional status lends their intellectual judgment any greater authority than that of any other rational person, or indeed a student. If I'm giving a lecture and making an argument to my students as to why they should accept a certain proposition or conclusion or judgment, and some precocious 13-year-old from the high school has come along to try out a few college classes, and she's super smart, and she hears what I have to say, and she points out a logical fallacy in my argument, I shouldn't be allowed to pull rank on her. If she's shown that my argument is bad, then she has undermined my judgment, and I ought to be willing under those circumstances to defer. So I think that if professors satisfy those 5 conditions, there is nothing problematic, and indeed, I think there's probably something extremely salutary about professors being willing to try to persuade their students of views, even when those views are subject to reasonable disagreement. And I think that this model of non-dogmatic advocacy would treat discussion of facts, the kinds of things that are discussed in the natural sciences, and discussion of values, the kinds of things that political theorists like me discuss, in exactly the same way. So on this view, arguing for even very controversial political positions in the classroom, for example, arguing for a universal unconditional basic income, arguing for the legitimacy under certain circumstances of faith-based legislation, arguing for the irrationality of democratic ways of making decisions. It's not essentially different from physicists arguing vigorously in the classroom for string theory. The 5 precepts of non-dogmatic advocacy apply just as well to the case of a discussion of political questions as it does to the discussion of whether string theory is indeed a promising theory in cosmology. In these kinds of cases, I want to say, professors quite appropriately tell students what to think, in that they seek to command their students' rational assent by reasoned argument. And I want to underline the word command there, because I think it's very important to see that when one makes an argument, a good faith, sincere, non-manipulative, rational argument for some conclusion, whether it be a conclusion about biology or physics, or a conclusion about politics or political justice, what one is doing is presenting arguments to compel a student's judgment. I mean, good arguments are precisely those arguments that ought to command assent, whatever one wants to believe, right? So if I'm not sure whether the cat is on the mat, even if I don't want the cat to be on the mat, if somebody opens the window and shows me the cat sitting there on the mat, the fact that I don't want the cat to be on the mat is neither here nor there. My rational judgment should be commanded and compelled by the evidence that is before my eyes. And I think that all rational argumentation, all rational inquiry is like that. To be sure, we sometimes make mistakes about whether indeed we should be rationally compelled by certain kinds of considerations. That's often going to be true in the domains that are subject to reasonable disagreement. But it doesn't mean that though we're fallible and we sometimes get things wrong, doesn't mean that we shouldn't be in the business of telling students what to think, in the sense that we adduce reasons that we think if they really appreciate those reasons, they'll have no choice but to accept certain judgments, certain propositions, certain claims as more likely to be true, more likely to be false, more cogent, better supported, less well supported by the data. That's just what rational inquiry is all about. So in these kinds of cases, even if professors are discussing controversial political positions, there's nothing wrong with professors engaging in non-dogmatic advocacy, seeking to command their students' assent by putting before them reasoned arguments for a particular conclusion. On the other hand, non-dogmatic advocacy would prohibit professors, and here I think DeVos would surely agree, to tell students what to think by manipulating, shaming, or coercing them, or by punishing or suppressing reasonable dissent, or by making your grade contingent on your professing or parroting back some controversial position. This is certainly in the realm of inappropriate brainwashing. But I think it's important to see that we can draw that distinction, and worries about bias and indoctrination, I think, arise only when that third precept is violated, only when there's clear manipulation, clear brainwashing, clear shaming or bullying or intimidation going on. Professors who conform to 1 and 2 at the top of the slide there should not be criticized for bias and indoctrination, at least as long as they conform to the 5 conditions that I laid out for non-dogmatic advocacy. So if that's right, then I think we can put some real pressure on DeVos's view. If what I've said is correct, then professors just are in the business of telling their students what to think. What we're trying to do is to give them reasons for beliefs, reasons for attitudes, reasons for actions, reasons that should command their judgment, should command their rational assent. And that just is to tell them what they should think. Again, we shouldn't be infallible about this. We should admit our limitations and be prepared to accept the force of the better argument ourselves when somebody argues back and shows that we've made a mistake. But to deprive professors of the activity of actually giving people reasons for thinking certain kinds of things is essentially to castrate the intellectual project. To be open to reasons for certain kinds of judgments and beliefs, to be willing to be swayed by the force of the better argument, is just what it is to be a rational being. To offer such reasons to students in good faith, long as you satisfy my conditions for non-dogmatic advocacy, that's just what it is to treat them as rational beings, in my view. And here we come to the criticism of DeVos, and more generally of those conservatives who encourage students to be on guard for supposed liberal bias in the classroom, to encourage students to resist or dismiss professors' reasoned arguments, even arguments for controversial political positions, just as mere manipulation or indoctrination or bias, just because they're saying something politically controversial, is to encourage students to act and behave irrationally. It's to encourage them to act and behave irrationally because it's to close their minds to reason and to erode the crucial distinction between irrational manipulation and rational suasion. And the failure to draw that distinction, I'm afraid, that's the road to fake news. That's the road to alternative facts. And I'm afraid that in the end, it's the road to totalitarian thought control. All of the things that George Orwell argued very eloquently against in 1984 and many of his essays. And it worries me deeply that the incoming Education Secretary, Betsy DeVos, doesn't seem to understand this very basic point. Thank you very much.